been in confidential collusion with my son, I see, and has access to a lot of facets of my life which I don't have access to. So thank you, Kaushik. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the Indian Society of Pediatric Neurosurgery, our guests from abroad. It has been truly one of the most humbling events of my life, serving as president of your society for a record period now of 5 years, caused, as you heard, by the pandemic. In this period, I have had chance to represent your society in the platform of the International Society, the European Society, and the Asia-Australasian Society, where I've just taken over as the Chairman of Education yet again. I thought, who would I dedicate this oration to? And I felt it would be most appropriate to dedicate this oration to our patients, the pediatric patients that we have the honor to treat as pediatric neurosurgeons. And the first question that I ask myself is, do we look at the world in the same way that our patients see the world? And I share with you a painting which some of you may have seen, which I show around the world and ask neurosurgeons what they see. And they all answer that they see a man and woman in intimate embrace, which is, I'm sure, the answer you would give me if I asked you what you saw. But I also lecture in middle schools, and I go to schools to teach children how to avoid head and spine injuries in their lives. And when I show this same picture to middle school children, do you know what they say they see? They see 6 dolphins. Such is our biased adult eyes as we look at the world. I think the first lesson in pediatric neurosurgery is to understand that we look at the world from a completely different standpoint to the standpoint of our patients. And that's what perhaps makes this specialty so unique. And if we believe what Dr. Darwin told us many moons ago, how the next generation is born more evolved than our generation, here is a unique opportunity to not look down upon our little patients, but to appreciate that our little patients are perched much higher up in the pedestal of evolution compared to their caregivers. So whereas we look, they can see. We can listen, they can hear. We can touch, they can feel. And whereas we live, they experience. And that is the difference in pediatric neurosurgery between the treaters and those that are treated. And so I thought, for this oration, I will talk about detachment and attachment in pediatric neurosurgery. And of course, when I talk about detachment and attachment, I will tell you the basis of this talk stems out of my belief that the theory of pediatric neurosurgery is about answering questions. The practice of pediatric neurosurgery is about questioning answers. And the attachment with which we are all familiar are attachments like this. This little child I saw with this amazing condition of an amniotic band wrapped around the bottom of his neck, with a condition which caused his cardiac pulsations to be visible through his sternum. And when you looked at his MRI, this amniotic band was stuck to the apex of what we now know as a limited dorsal myeloschisis, but which completely defeats all the embryology that Professor Pang described in the origin of this condition. Because here's not a myeloschisis that has developed in the way that Professor Pang described the embryology. Here's one that's been pulled out by this amniotic band. And I think when I showed this to Dakin himself, he said he hadn't got a clue how this could occur. But this is the sort of attachment and the detachment as we proceed to do surgery that most of us are concerned with in pediatric neurosurgery. But the attachment and detachment I will talk to you about over the next 20 minutes or so will be a different form of attachment and detachment. It is the attachment and detachment to the subject and idea of pediatric neurosurgery, to the patient who is in the center of our lives, to the parents who are the surrogate sufferers in this entire act, and finally to the students that we train and to whom we are responsible. To the subject, I always tell my trainees that chance rather than claims, credentials, or character creates the canvas on which we paint our lives. And this chance in pediatric neurosurgery came to me just 2 months after I came back to this country in 1994. This was the time that the second ever course of the ISPN was being held in Mumbai. The first course had been held in Delhi. And at the end of the Mumbai course, 2 giants in pediatric neurosurgery in Delhi and Mumbai were locked in a debate as to where the third course was going to be held. And whereas one insisted it should be Delhi, the other insisted it should be Mumbai. And as I wrote on this slide, as you know, when 2 elephants fight, it is the grass that feels the true impact. It was me, the grass, that was done to by both of them. And they told me, right, since we can't have it in Mumbai or Delhi, you're doing it in Calcutta. So 2 months after my return to this country, and 4 months after, before I had set up even a practice in the city, I was organizing the first ever ISPN course in Calcutta. And rubbing shoulders with giants like this, Professor Alapi Khan, Dave McDonald, Warwick Peacock, all of whom came to the first ever course in pediatric neurosurgery that I held, that I organized in Calcutta, and who had a profound influence on my decision to do this particular specialty. As I said, chance more than credentials. And of course, thereafter, I've had the opportunity to rub shoulders with a lot of great pediatric neurosurgeons, some of whom from this country and some of whom are from abroad, a number of whom are present in the audience today. But I will share with you 2 people with whom I've had an opportunity to engage in discussions in pediatric neurosurgery and yet smile, and whose contribution to my development of pediatric neurosurgery I cannot acknowledge more. And I only show these 2 individuals because they are 2 individuals with whom I will no longer be able to share a smile. The attachment that we as pediatric neurosurgeons like to think about are attachments like this. When we have a challenging 4-year-old with a cavernoma in the brainstem that has bled, and you think you have to take it out, and you plan your approach, and you're able to get that cavernoma out, and you look at an MRI like this in a child who's recovered uneventfully from this surgery. And the surgeon's smile then is but a reflection of the anticipated smile of the patient and the parents. And I was amazed to see this particular article published, which says physicians experiencing intense emotions while seeing their patients. What happens to their patients? What is the impact on doctor-patient relationship when this happens? And this article goes on to quote, experiencing intense emotions in the presence of patients was frequent amongst physicians, and the type of reaction affected their clinical relationship. Detachment, is that better? Or is it a cause of surgical arrogance? As this wonderful article in the BMJ entitled, Excising the Surgical Ego to Accelerate Progress in the Culture of Surgery says. And I quote from the conclusion of the article, which says, arrogant surgeons are detached from their patients, who they perceive as stepping stones to their own immortality. And in fact goes on to say, God is in operating room 4. Emotional attachment, on the other hand, particularly for a pediatric neurosurgeon, may be a cause for humility. Because I firmly believe that humility is the heavenly hallmark of a happy healer. And my anesthetists all make fun of me and tell me that the only question I ever ask them, I never ask them how they are, I never ask them how their children or their partners are. The only ever question I seem to always ask them is, has she woken up all right? And you know the intensity of that feeling when you enter into the recovery room and ask your anesthetist this question. So does emotional attachment to your patient help a pediatric neurosurgeon? I would venture to say probably yes, because it leads to what I call this could have been my child syndrome. And when you see that patient, you say this could well have been your son or daughter. How would I like my son or daughter to have been treated in this situation? It helps build a rapport of trust with the family. And above all, it helps communication. And communication is the most common medical procedure that we all perform in our lives. An average physician requiring serious communication 200,000 times in an average practicing lifetime. Compare that to only 15,000 times that an average neurosurgeon has to make a burr hole. And yet, we have minimal physical education in this country, at least, as far as communication skills are concerned. And communication skills, as we all know, decline throughout residency and reach their nadir in early consultant life. Communication requires attachment, and attachment helps you to be a good listener, as this wonderful book entitled What Patients Say and What Doctors Hear, and the two are not separated by the length of just a stethoscope. Active listening requires the ability to paraphrase, to summarize, and to get the person you're talking to ask you more questions. Sometimes these questions can be trifle embarrassing. As the parents whom you're talking to about the brainstem tumor you're going to do on their child ask you what's the problems, and you say, your child can die, your child can have a neurological deficit, your child can have a cognitive problem, there can be wound breakdown, there can be hydrocephalus requiring a shunt or an ETV. And when you've spent 20 minutes in what I call an act of disaster elocution to the parents, quite often at least, the parents in Calcutta will turn around and say, you mean there is nothing to fear? And I often tell them, just telling you this makes me fear. If it doesn't make you fearful, good for you. We are now in the era where we talk about relationship-centered communication. A communication which is a communication set up with the goal of establishing an authentic relationship. We know that relationship to parents of patients are therapeutic for the parents and often to the patients, and that it helps understand the patient's perspective. And then it becomes a partnership, and a partnership in shared decision-making about the child's future. Communication skills are taught to all living beings on this planet. But communication skills, like medical procedures, need to be learned, need to be practiced, and needs deliberate practice and feedback to be successful. Quite often I ask myself when I talk to parents, are we speaking the same language? A study recently published from NIMHANS, Bangalore, suggests that in this country doctors overestimate their patient's ability to understand medical information. And if you consider that 88% of this country has what we call intermediate to low health literacy, then you understand what we're talking about. Intermediate health literacy, by the way, is defined as an ability to determine whether to take a medicine with food or without food by reading from the label on the back of the medicine. And 88% of our parents lack this information. The other situation, where attachment and detachment becomes a fundamental question, is when you have to break bad news to the parents. A 14-year-old came to us 5 hours after trauma, GCS3, acute subdural hematoma, aspiration, hemoperitoneum, subcapsular hematoma of the spleen, ICP 68, 24 hours after the TBI, decompressive craniectomy, about 24 hours later, that's the CT scan in the child with bilateral fixed dilated pupils. And the question is, what do you say to the parents? I think it is very important to first talk about the almost irreversibility of the situation before you confess the total irreversibility. I find it useful to share with them the extent of the damage, tell them the ICP and how it rose in spite of the decompressive craniectomy. If necessary, show them the scans, show them the patient, show them the ECG, show them the pulse oximeter, and ultimately talk of something that we all dread to talk about. Talk of the possibility that the best outcome at this stage could be a permanent vegetative state, and almost make the parents want death instead of vegetative disability on their 6-year-old. And again, a certain amount of human involvement and attachment is necessary to go through these steps. It is very important to be able to assess the relatives' perception. Do they have realistic expectations? It is important during a communication of bad news to study the verbal and body language of the recipients, the parents in this case. Note the emotional content of their response and tailor your statement to adapt to their perception and emotional state. And here is another wonderful paper published exploring the relationship between medical attachment, emotional intelligence, and communication between doctors and their patients. And one of the very important facets this looks at is medical errors. I'm sure errors stoke humility, but humility is no error. And I always misquote the quotation from the top to say, to err is the surgeon's prerogative, to forgive is the patient's, read parents in this case. So how do we cope with error? As a pediatric neurosurgeon, do you stay attached or detached when you are in error? Here's a child who came on a day I was on call with a fall from a height with a head injury. There was, the parent said, some neck and headache that he complained of. He was GCS 5 by the time I came to see him. His scan showed this horrendous picture. Soon he became GCS 3 and blew a pupil, was on a ventilator. We did have screening cervical spine pictures at that time, which were not perfect. We rushed him to the operation theater, did what we as pediatric neurosurgeons love to do best, tried to sort out the problem with his brain. He improved. He began talking. On post-operative day 6, started complaining again of severe neck pain and had restriction of movements. The bell rang, we did a scan, and this was an injury that we'd missed during the primary surgery. We went back, talked to the parents, told them the honest truth that in a hurry we had not done this, but now we needed to get this right. And when we did this, I noticed at that same time there was a little pus coming out of his craniotomy wound. We sent a swab, it grew Klebsiella. We thought, right, let's give him some antibiotics and let him go home, which is what we did. Parents brought him back a week later with a seizure, and this is what he had. And again, we had ignored that warning sign of pus on the wound, came back with an abscess which we had to drain, again explaining to the parents this was another complication that we had to sort out. And I always ask myself, had emotional rush precluded satisfactory scientific deliberation when we rushed him with GCS 3 into the operating room? Every relationship is a two-way process. And therefore, when we talk about attachment to our patients, we have to also ask ourselves, should we allow the child to be attached to you as the pediatric neurosurgeon? In psychology, the attachment theory of psychosocial development states that individuals form enduring patterns of interpersonal behavior through internalization of interactions with their primary carers in infancy. And the primary carers in infancy become the pediatric neurosurgeon once you start treating the child. This is a photograph I took in the plains of the Serengeti in Africa, where this lioness had just killed a deer. And as he finished his feast of antelope intestine, without realizing that this mother deer had just given birth to this little foal, this little newborn deer saw for the first time a living creature in front of him was the lioness, and went on to continually follow this lioness as the first creature he had developed an attachment to. It's a phenomenon that does occur in our patients as well. So when I had this small child with severe deformity like this, with multiple dystrophic conditions, who I had operated on with multiple operations on the dystrophisms, then proceeded to do this, which is to put in a VEPTR to expand his thoracic cage, and then many years later, after this had expanded his scoliosis, went back and did a primary fixation. I became like his friend and mentor for a great part of 6 years, almost 6 years, in fact 4 years. And then the parents said they needed surgery for bilateral congenital dislocation of hips. I sent him to a pediatric orthopedic surgeon in our hospital. Unfortunately, during the surgery, he had massive blood loss, had sepsis, multi-organ failure, and finally ended up on a ventilator, brain dead. That was the day his parents came to my office and said to me, "Can you come and see him once?" And I did. And this is a phenomenon well quoted, again in psychology texts, called terminal cognitive arousal. And as I put my hand on his forehead, he seemed to blink. But his ECG became flat within 15 minutes. I was distraught. And I realized I had an emotional attachment to him, which I should not have perhaps had as a pediatric neurosurgeon. And I asked myself, can sentiments suppress science? As in this child, who was all of 2 years old, with a medulloblastoma that was bleeding. And as I was trying to resect it, the anesthetist informed me that one line through which they were transfusing blood was not working. What are the thoughts that went through my head then? Should I stop and come away? Is this child going to die? I knew it was the only child of the parents, and the first thing I thought, they'll sue me. And then finally, the most mature response came. What was my experience of these in the past? A child bleeding like that from a very vascular medulloblastoma, what should you do? And what reminded me of my past told me that I had to rush and take it out. It was the only way to stop the blood. And this is what we ended up doing. And there is no more beautiful picture ingrained in a pediatric surgeon's brain than when at the end of an operation like this, you're able to see a cerebral aqueduct pouting out clear CSF, and you know that you've done your good deed for the day. So detachment, I think, is very important in making decisions in crisis like this. It also helps fostering the right doctor-patient relationship model, stops us from being paternalistic, and makes us adopt the interpretive or deliberative model of doctor-patient relationship, which is what we need. Quite often, detachment breeds distrust. I always say that sympathy cannot supplant science, but caring can complement curing. Stress and burnout are much more in doctors who are detached, as this particular study, led to be by the late Professor Michel Gérard, showed. In fact, very interestingly, burnout was less among groups that did pediatric surgery, because these surgeons said that it is easier to empathize with patients and parents because we feel a member of a 3-member team. Can detachment be a dressing for ignorance? And I often ask myself, how often do we tell the parents, I do not know the answer? When the parents of this child that I'm going to show you came to me and said, why does my child have a problem with his head? And also, why does he have a little hole in the back? I didn't know, because the child had this very amazing condition which I had never seen before. This was a secondary relation disorder of a retained medullary cord. I'd only ever heard Dackling present 2 cases at that time. And yet he had craniosynostosis. So we operated on his retained medullary cord, and then we went on to operate on his craniosynostosis. But till today, when the parents ask what's the relationship, I haven't found that out from medical literature. And so I ask, and I ask you as well, is confession of ignorance better or worse than ignorance of confession? Is not knowing everything a sign of professional incompetence? Is it a medico-legal weakness which may be exploited? And finally, I will end with the story of a patient which highlights how detachment can breed distrust. This was a child with a brainstem tumor much more recently. I knew when you operate on a child with a tumor like this, you have to be detached. And I was. And we did surgery to remove the tumor. The post-operative MRI made us feel elated. And yet, 6 months later, the tumor came back. And he was dead within 6 weeks. 4 weeks later, I received a formal letter from his father, delivered by hand, which my secretary had to receive. And a lot of us who practice in this country know, when 6 weeks after a patient dies, you get a letter like this, which you have to receive, you know it's a medical legal letter coming from a consumer court or from some court where they've complained against you. I opened the letter, and this is what it said. It said, I spent 8 lakh rupees to try and save my only child, and failed. But there may be others who cannot afford it, but you can try, doctor, like you tried for my child. So here I enclose a check of 8 lakhs for the next child you see with this type of tumor whose parents cannot afford this treatment. The sort of thing that rekindles the entire hope and aspirations that we have all had as doctors. And I cannot deny that I read the last bit of the letter with a fuzzy appearance that occurs when you have teardrops on your conjunctiva impeding refraction through your lens. In fact, when I read about parental attachment styles, there's some fantastic articles in literature. There is a fantastic book called Mind Sight by Dan Siegel. And all of this, believe it or not, advises how to deal with parents of sick children. We never have the time to think about it, least to do research about it. So what do I conclude at this stage of my life about attachment or detachment? I think it's very important to first assess the psychological mindset of the parents, then decide on the degree of attachment. Remember, attachment and detachment has to be tailored to the parent's need, not to the surgeon's emotional requirement. Be prepared to change depending on alteration in parental attitude. Never have any attachment to your patient during a surgical procedure. Have it before or afterwards. And never let parents dictate, but always let them have a say. And this is the literature which is available for all categories of situations that you may encounter as a pediatric neurosurgeon, with psychological advice of how to deal with it. And finally, I said I would talk to you about relationship with trainees. And a lot of you here are teachers and professors in various institutes in this country. I would only say to you, with students I've learned, don't classify them. Don't characterize them. Don't think of some trainees as good and some trainees as average or bad. And I always tell all professors and teachers and trainers I talk to the famous matchbox story, which is that as a trainer or a teacher in any branch of medicine, you must understand that your trainees are like matches in a matchbox. Some you need to strike once, some you need to strike thrice, but each one glows with the same amount of light. So remember, in this debate about attachment and detachment, that the job of the doctor is to keep the patient amused while nature heals the disease. And I end by telling you that today is the birthday of Hazrat Ali, who is attributed with this quotation: know that life is a test. Some days will be for you, some days will be against you, but you always need to be prepared. So if you're in Calcutta, as some of you will be in a day's time, and you're moving around the Hooghly, as a good pediatric neurosurgeon, keep your eyes and ears open, because you might suddenly see something you never expected. Thank you very much.